I want to bring in the next panel, one that is near and dear to my heart. Our next keynote is titled Guarding the Vaults. It's a panel discussion on open source software and bank modernization security. Please welcome our panelist, Milad Maleki, Senior Advisor to the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the US Department of Treasury, Brian Fox, Co-founder and CTO of Sonatype, Lakkakula, Senior Director of Cybersecurity and Technology Controls in JPMorgan Chase, Alicja, Cade, Office of the CISO at Google Cloud, and Barron-DiCamillo, Manager Director and Global Head of Cyber Operations at Citi, and good friend Omkhar, Arasaratnam, General Manager of OpenSSF. I tried my best with my Italian accent. Thank you.
There we go. There have been a number of am I on? I'm on. There have been a number of very serious presentations. This one's going to be a little more lighthearted because it's only about security, right? We got that handled. Right. So I'm Omkhar Arasaratnam. As Gab mentioned, I'm the General Manager of the OpenSSF. And we're going to go down this way and do introductions, and then we're going to get in some interesting questions. But of course, because we're open source, we would love to hear from the community if y'all have any questions as well. Without going too far over time, Jennifer will be very angry with me. So with that, Milad?
Yes, I'm Milad Maleki. I'm from Office of Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Protection of US Department of Treasury. We execute Treasury's role as financial sector risk management agency. We also chair a board of regulators. We chair G7's cyber expert group. We also do interagency policy work around cybersecurity. Thanks.
Thank you, Milad. Rao?
Thank you for having me.
Oh, pleasure.
Hi, everyone. Lakkakula, JPMorgan Chase, Cybersecurity and Technology Controls. My focus being developer security in JPMorgan Chase. I also sit on the Open Source Security Foundation board, where JPMorgan Chase was a founding member 3 years back. With the Finos, obviously I'm super happy to be here. JPMorgan being a platinum member of Finos for a long time and contributing to a project like Perspective. And the fact we're talking about security here is I'm super happy and glad to share my insights.
Alicja, Cade, Google Cloud. I'm director in Office of the CISO, and I look after financial services globally. Super excited to be here, so thank you for the invite. And hopefully we can all work this out together.
We got it.
Good morning, Anne Barron-DiCamillo. I'm the Managing Director, Global Head for Cybersecurity Operations at Citi. Also, we have been members here at Citi at Finos, as well as John Meadows, one of my peers, is on the board for OSSF. So happy to be here to represent John. He's in London and wasn't able to come across the pond for this, so excited to be here for that. I'm also the chair of the board for FSISAC, so excited to really bring together this community with the work that we're doing in the financial sector through FSISAC and talking through some of the working groups and ways to engage there as well for our financial sector and participants in the audience. So look forward to the conversation. Thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Brian Fox. Like several others here, I'm also on the board of the OpenSSF. I'm also the co-founder and CTO of Sonatype. If you haven't heard of Sonatype, we're the company that runs Maven Central, where all the world gets its open source Java. So you're probably using our stuff even if you don't know it. And we've also been helping many organizations here for well over a decade manage their open source supply chain.
So as you've heard, there are several people from my board here, so I'm going to have a bunch of softball questions. I want you all to come up with some difficult ones, especially as we get to the end of the year. So, jokes aside, we know that open source is prevalent everywhere. There was an estimate that it's in 90% of commercial software that's being used. I say that's probably a low ball. And of course, we're here to talk about the financial sector, which is one of the critical infrastructures as per CISA and our government. So we're here to talk about how the financial sector, as they take their digitization journey further and start to embrace more open source software, how you should think about consuming open source software in a secure manner. And you're going to hear perspectives from our government, from technologists, from banks as well. So We have a couple of questions. I promised Rao I wouldn't make any up. But why don't we start off with this one? And this is to the panel. Feel free to jump in as you see fit. What kind of attacks have you seen against the open source software supply chain?
So I'll start, happy to start. I think the significant amount of attacks that we're seeing are really around typo squatting. And there's two specific areas that we've seen in that space. One is really more targeted to the developer, trying to have a typo result in download of malicious code. The other is more targeted towards those packages. I think we see a lot of times that individuals will go out to open source. If they mistype it, they download these malicious packages. And again, I'm talking the sharp increase that we've seen. I think it was reported by our partners here at Sonatype about malicious packages over the last year is just twofold increase over previous years. And so this is becoming a reality associated with our development community, is just the ease at which the malicious code is being ingested into our pipelines. And I think it's different. It's really important to differentiate between malicious and vulnerable. Vulnerable means it could potentially be exploited, but malicious it's definitely going to be exploited and detonated. And so I think there's a differentiator there too that we all are working towards educating our communities to ensure that they don't go to unapproved sources, because this is becoming so prevalent. Thanks,
Ann. Brian?
Yeah, thanks for, you said all the great things. John and I worked together a lot on that.
John, help me.
Yeah, okay. We wrote the open source consumption manifesto at the Open Source Security Foundation, so take a look at that if you want to see some ideas there. But yeah, we're tracking well over 250,000 components that were intentionally malicious. And in addition to the points you made, I'll just highlight one extra one, that because of the way these components tend to not actually duplicate the code they're pretending to be, it means they fail on the developer machine when they build. And I think that this is because the attackers haven't had to try harder because our defenses are so low. But there's an unintended benefit of that to their perspective, which is these malicious components don't usually get checked in, so you won't see them in your typical pipeline scans. They're completely invisible to your existing defenses, and that's something you need to really pay attention to. It's like the old days of browsers when they were inherently vulnerable. People would go to a malicious website, get a backdoor dropped, and they'd go, whoa, this isn't the site I thought I wanted to be at, hit back and move on with life. That's the equivalent of what's happening with developers right now, because they don't understand that these malicious components may have just actually exfiltrated data or left a backdoor.
There's one additional thing we saw, which I thought was unusual. It wasn't so much malicious as it was additional messaging from a hacktivist type researcher who wanted to put a message into the code to foot stomp a message around Russia-Ukraine conflict. And the typical scanning that we do obviously didn't pick this up because it wasn't malicious. And so I think there's even the aspect of how certain researchers are leveraging the open source community to inject these messages into our programs, into our environments that are, again, not malicious, but definitely create a stir and a controversy associated with the kind of the abuse that we're seeing there.
Definitely disruptive. Anyone else want to jump in on this?
Maybe if I can bring in a Mandiant and Google Cloud perspective, because of course threat is our food on a daily basis. To add to that complexity and sharp increase that Anne has quoted at the beginning from Sonatype, we want to also bring to the perspective another layer of statistics. And that is, Mandiant has averaged that an institution, average institution, has about 244 relationships with technology suppliers. And imagine within that how many pieces of code go through your veins, right? On the top of that, Linux Foundation statistics, which is that average application has 49 vulnerabilities and 80 dependencies. And dependency confusion is another trend that we also are seeing. So it's almost like a complex matrix that is just spinning out. So that's my contribution here.
Thanks, Alicia. Rao?
I think the problem with the question is with Brian on the panel, it's hard to beat him. He publishes the software supply chain State of Union report, which we all actually look at the trends and the attacks. I think I uncovered the typo squatting that was. But I think the overall theme is we've been traditionally seeing the vulnerabilities in the software we consume. But the last few years, we're seeing malicious packages. The intent is actually having a bad intent to start with. So they're kind of depending on the developers making mistakes, like a packages with one letter offset, so that it looks like authentic package, but it's actually a malicious package. So I think typo squatting is another big one, and also the namespace confusion that's actually starts showing up these days, where someone creating a malicious package with the same name as your internal package, with the way the package managers work, it actually get the preference to it. That's a bigger issue we've been seeing. I think overall, we're seeing doubling and tripling of the malicious packages. That's a troubling trend.
Milad?
Yeah, and if I can just step back and look at the overall landscape, what's more in the news, and mostly because of recent global conflicts, is the denial of service attacks and DDoS attacks, but the if MOVEit or ION is any indication, the most effective vulnerabilities have been exploited has been through the third-party IT supply chain, that being the third-party software, open source packages dependencies, or even third-party scripts. And one of earlier talks, they mentioned Python being number one. Nowadays, scripting, the automating all the build pipeline, most of the DevOps, those are all can be targeted. Yeah.
Great point. Open source software is a public good, and the security of open source software depends on public sector, private sector, and the community all contributing in order to make that software secure. So the next question for the group is, as organizations consume open source software, what should they think about when managing their open source software supply chain to avoid some of these issues that you'd mentioned? Who wants to go first?
Well,
oh, big surprise.
You motioned towards me.
He did. That's true.
Like we talked about, the malicious stuff requires specific interventions to shield the developers. Things like, component firewalls to be able to block these things as they're coming down the development machine. Because as I said, traditional supply chain checks are not going to find them. And a lot of the traditional sort of boring vulnerabilities. I mean, from my perspective, Log4j was boring. It was last decade's war. It was a bug. It's arguable that it was even a bug. It was a combination of two features that existed together to create an exploitability that could later then be leveraged against you, which is boring compared to these new novel malicious attacks from my perspective. Many organizations are still struggling with that because you don't understand what's inside your software. You don't have good organizational bill of materials. And so being able to produce those things and track them will prepare you for the next Log4j. I won't ask you to raise your hands, but I know a lot of organizations spent something on the order of 6 months just figuring out if and where they used Log4j so that they could start to remediate it, versus other organizations who were prepared, remediated their portfolios of thousands of applications, no joke, within 4 days. I have data to show that. And so when you're thinking about your posture, think about the next vulnerability that might drop tomorrow and how prepared you are. And I think that will drive some of the right behaviors.
Thanks, Brian.
I'll say a plug for FSISAC. As chair of the board, we have a working group specifically, and so definitely encourage folks to get engaged in the working groups, because this is a great way to share ideas associated with things that are novel to those things that are BAU. I will say, to Brian's point, I think you're right. Having the SBOM type understanding of your environment is really important. I think where we struggled is really the supply chain third-party suppliers. That was the long tail for a lot of the large institutions. When you have, thousands of vendors, it's very difficult, specifically as these vendors are very small, mom and pop, to get ahead of that. And that's where the community comes back in to really be the ability to help there. And communities like OSSF are extremely important in that work.
We've actually, I would chime into the SBOM fact as well, that this is something that one has to use and to really understand the ingredients of the packages that are being used. But also we have brought to the world Salsa, which actually we open sourced, which is almost like a framework. And it stands for supply chain level software artifacts. And if you think about, let's say, analogy in the food chain, SBOM is the list of your ingredients in the grocery store, whatever item you're buying. I'm European, so I'm really keen on reading all the listings.
You're also making me very hungry.
Yes. So that's your SBOM. But Salsa itself is almost like recommendations or guidelines of how you should be handling the food, right? Don't leave it in the hot surfaces, or keep it in the fridge and etc., or freeze after. And on the top of that, also minimal viable security product baseline, i.e. what should be, let's say, your nutrients that's minimal in the product. And I think if we take that combination of those approaches, which really isn't a very new idea from the kind of risk and control management, this can be applied to anything. That really combines. And the Salsa isn't just a theoretical tool. We really spent 10 years developing it, and we've shared it because we do believe that this is something that can support it. But Salsa is Salsa, of course, but I think the work that we're doing here together with Finos and with Common Cloud Controls Program, anything to do with the open source, this is going to help everyone really bring that into their organizations and implement and make sure this is the day-to-day usage. And that's really what's going to secure us with the common taxonomy as well.
Because we're talking about food and SBOMs, I'm going to take a different state. How many here like candy? I guess it's a bad question after Halloween.
A lot of you are lying.
How many of you been to Economy Candy Store in the East Side? Oh, that's actually very few. So I'm actually not from here. I come from Seattle, but when I come here, I try to go to Idilan or Economy Candy Store, grab some candy for my kids. So the reason I'm trying to talk about is obviously when we talk about SBOMs, we look at, a candy bar and ingredients in it. But in reality, with a big enterprise like us, or most of us, it's like going to a big candy store like Economy store. Racks of candies, like millions of candy. And if you look at actually, some are no longer even produced. Some maybe even expired. I'm not talking about a candy store, but you can think about it. I think it's the reality in big enterprise. Like, actually even having a visibility of where everything is, what's coming from, that's the first big step, as Brian and Ann mentioned. But even I think having that sense of like, most of software we consume, actually, they're no longer active. To matter of fact, I think, Brian, your report says 85% of the Maven packages now are actually inactive.
That's across all open source.
Not only just Java, but I think all. So I think that the fundamentally, that the two things I would say, I think we have to solve is, one, security from the start. Security is not something we have to think afterwards. When it starts at the ingestion time, I think understanding how developers are consuming into the enterprise, and then consume from a reputable sources and minimize the number of dependencies. The same way I'm talking about candy no longer produced. And I think making sure the modernization and innovation comes from open source, but also customer trust is paramount in our industry, regulated industry. So the only way that we is like combining that modernization with the best practices of keeping up to date with the software. When you bring in new dependency, take that extra moment to understand, is it reputable source? Who actually maintained? Is it active? How do I keep up with that dependency? Because once it get in, it's very hard to get out of the system.
Thanks, Rao. Milad?
Yes, I agree. But I think for financial institutions with different sizes, this question differs. For some of them, most of this fall under their vendor governance and that vendor risk management for some, which has its own challenges with contracting issue, transparency from the providers, from what the questions to ask, what the right questions to ask, if ask for the SBOM is, and then for larger institutions, more like visibility, and then the other, what falls between is if that visibility, that inventory of all those dependencies, and as you bring the new dependency, that's Raul, you mentioned, does that translate to risk information to get to business management so that they can make their decisions for new development, for instance, with that knowledge? Because I know, and now AI is talk of the town, so everyone wants to put AI functionality in the applications, but I wonder if the risk of bringing up those new dependencies really visible to those that make the decision of having that additional visibility or functionality. So
maybe to plug a few OpenSSF projects here. So if you're worried about upstream and what those dependencies look like from a security perspective, we have a project called Scorecard that can help you with that, to understand where there may be risk. It considers freshness. It considers a bunch of other factors. And again, like all things in finance, it allows you to appropriately manage your risk. SBOMs, I'm sure Ellen Friedman is somewhere quite happy hearing me talk about SBOMs at the moment. SBOMs are great, but obviously if you are struggling with more basic security controls in your organization, don't jump to SBOMs, like figure those out first. Salsa is amazing. In addition to salsa, now I'm going to start to get hungry again. So to take Alicia's example of salsa being the ingredient list, combining the ingredients in the right order and getting the right results is pretty important too. If you were to take a recipe and just throw a bunch of stuff in a bowl, it's probably not going to turn out like you want. So one of the ways of cryptographically assuring that the stuff has been combined in the right order using the right instructions is another OpenSSF project called SigStore. So I'd encourage you to look at all of those, and of course, openssf.org for more information. So we're winding down on time. We have one more question before y'all will get a call to action opportunity. The last question, and Milad, you seem very well suited to begin this one, so I will direct it to you. Open source software can provide opportunities for innovation in financial sector, but how should regulators and banks think about adopting open source software securely and, from your perspective, policy-wise?
So I think there's some education needed on both sides. It is important to emphasize how open source can be a really force multiplier enabler for innovation, and then alongside of explaining how unique the ecosystem is and how different it is to, you know, how highly decentralized, all those factors that usually leaders won't look at and won't understand. And the other side, developers, it's great to understand the regulations and standards or compliance that financial institution has to go through for implementing their tools. I think that's one side. We have some initiatives on looking at how we can eliminate a class of a category of vulnerabilities in entirely. For instance, this administration looking at the memory safe and memory vulnerabilities. Yeah, that's
Great.
I can think of
Rao,
other-
how about you?
I think that there's encouraging trend in the regulatory and the laws coming in from our government is I think they're focusing more on actually getting the security from the start and then focusing more on the developer. So it's more empathy towards the developer. That actually is very encouraging. Secure by default, secure by design, that's a good initiative by CISA. The other thing I noticed with this administration is that actually there's a push towards the onus is not just on the end users, but the security is now a shared responsibility with the software providers and also the end users together. I mean, that includes even the products we build to our customers. So I'm not saying it's not just us. I think it's a shared responsibility. So I think overall the trend being very encouraging.
Alicia, I mean, you've got a very unique background here, having played both sides of the table.
I'm a recovering CISO from financial services, disclosure. So
How many days has it been?
A year and a half. I'm doing fine. So yeah, I totally understand the regulatory perspective, and of course, regulatory conversations have been a major part of my life for nearly 8 years. And I think the key, I also want to lean on what David was saying earlier in a discussion. We were talking here about shared responsibility. It's more than that. I think it's a shared fate. And that's why we very much, and Phil Venables especially, is part of the White House cybersecurity advisors group. And we are really advocating as well for the threat-led, risk-based regulation, and we're really glad to see that actually in the US this is being taken on board. Of course, we all operate, majority of us operate in the global realm, and this is where we would like to also make sure that other regulators as well look into harmonizations from the global perspective. I think some level of harmonization is gonna happen in the US because of all the conversations, really constructive conversations and work that we are doing all together as part of PHYSIC and FSI-SAC as well, and with Treasury. But I think it has to go further because, again, from APAC and EMEA perspective, we need to join the forces. We're all fighting the same risk. So we're going to continue, of course, to support it, and collaboration will be here key. And it's not anymore them and us. It is really, really shared fate.
I think from the actual regulator perspective, really ensuring that they hold hold the financial institutions to the fire, their feet to the fire, associated with ensuring that code is scanned on an ingestion. Just some of the simple hygiene practices that we've talked about. I think the regulating community, we all have different environments, we all have different threat models, but at the end of the day, there are some basic controls that need to be part of these reviews. And again, back to the shared responsibility, getting being part of that community and ensuring that they understand where those differentiators are, and not focusing so much there, but on these basic controls and the hygiene aspects. Just some of these simple practices, and making sure that's part of the review and that financial institutions are playing by those rules when you're looking internal. But to your point, Alicia, I think the broader community being involved in those discussions, educating themselves and ensuring that the thoughts and the processes and the policies that they're thinking about are brought into those conversations so they get the perspectives of the institutions in which they're going to be applied.
I have a lot of thoughts on this topic. Fortunately, I have a session at 2:40 today talking about this exact thing, so I'm not going to steal my thunder, but I will talk about that. I will also cover some of the malicious data as well. So,
got it. Well, we are out of time. However, I'm going to go back down the panel and ask for what's your call to action for the audience? What kind of bankers would we be if there wasn't a call to action at the end of our presentation? Maybe, Brian, we'll go back to you and then make our way back down.
Come see my session later. and get your bill of materials across your organization ready. The next vulnerability could be happening right now and we don't know it, so be prepared.
So I would say actually test. I think I'm back to my global cyber operational hat. Actually test the ingested software, not just for vulnerabilities, but for malicious code. We have a program that we used called malicious code detection, and started off with Java scripts. It's easy to pattern some of these basic capabilities that are being leveraged, and then bringing that into your program. So taking it beyond just looking for vulnerabilities, but looking for the malicious code and creating programs to do that, and partnering, through groups like the working group I talked about at FSISAC on how to borrow from firms like Citi that are doing this, and learnings that we share there together really help kind of elevate all of our programs.
I was once taught that all good lists come in 3. Right? So number 1, hygiene. And I think we've all said that. Keep your hygiene going and really make sure everybody knows what it means to be hygienic. And that might include modernization of your stack as well. Number 2, build resilient software. It is such a huge factor for the resiliency of the sector and from national security perspective as well. So building that resilient software has to be key, whether you're building it as part of your institutional initiatives or actually as part of the open source. That will be key. Number 3 is invest. And I don't mean here just money. Of course, we are heavily supporting the growth of cybersecurity and open source software, but I think it's everyone's time as well. And that means education, and that also means participation. So really, let's carry on with the community efforts.
Problem after going after all is all the good points are covered. So I'm going to stress one thing though. So involve and collaborate. If I have to stress that one. So we have so much energy in the last few years on the software supply chain security, OpenSSF, FSISAC as working group on software supply chain. Even public sector started a lot of working groups, and most of them are actually, I think pretty much all of them are free to join, observe, listen, participate. I think the only way we can solve this problem is involve together, work together, because it's a problem we all have to solve.
I just echo what Raul said, and Alicia and her previous remarks. Let's collaborate. There are so many councils, FSISAC, so many opportunities to get together, work on these issues. There are many public work streams. Our office worked most of last year on the cloud report that we have now to identify the gaps and challenges in adoption of cloud in financial institutions. We have 6-7 work streams through FSISAC and FBIG that you can work on. We just started working on our response to the AI executive order that just released. There's opportunities there to work, collaborate. Yeah.
So I have a call to action for all of you. Go to openssf.org, sign up, help. As I mentioned earlier, the security of open source software is a shared accountability between public sector, private sector, and the community. And we need your help. You don't need to be a software engineer. There's lots of things that you can do. There's a lot of financial sector professionals here, security professionals, and technologists in general. Come to openssf.org. Join us in this journey to make open source software more secure. I thank my panelists and Gab for giving us the opportunity. All right. Great job, guys. High five. All right.